My perspective on the full service agency is like that positioning is only effective if you're a full service to one problem. So it's not to say that you can't have multiple service offerings, like you can have multiple service offerings, but they should be focused on being a complete solution to one problem, a very specific problem.
What's up, agency owners? Jason Swenk here with another episode of the Smart Agency Mastercast, a podcast for the agency owner that wants to hear what is working for other agency owners and what is not. And on today's episode, I have a great person that's going to talk about how an agency increased their profitability without adding more staff, more people, more problems, and really eliminating that stuff. So let's go ahead and jump into the show. Hey, Marcel, welcome to the show.
Jason, it is an honor and a privilege to be here. I've been listening to the show for a long time, and I really appreciate you having me.
Yeah, man, I'm excited to have you on. So tell us a little bit of your backstory.
My name is Marcel, as you mentioned. I'm the founder of a company called Parakeeto, and my first business ever was an agency. Like a lot of people, I'm sure that are listening to the show. Back in 2015, I was doing real estate virtual reality services. So turning houses into 3D models that you could do, VR tours of. That's back before you could do it with your iPhone. And I remember at that time struggling with the unit economics of my service, where it was a buyer's market in my town. Houses were sitting on the market for years at a time. Real estate agents were willing to pay me about $300 to do something that took 20 to 30 hours to do. So very early in that business, I realized it could never scale to be more than just a hobby for me. And then a few years later, I got interested in software, met our mutual friend, Dan, and eventually connected with another agency owner named Jared, who explained to me that he spent almost 2 days a week in spreadsheets trying to answer questions about his business. Like, can we take on this client? And do we need to hire staff? Are we well utilized? What clients are performing well and which ones aren't? And he said, there's got to be a better way to do this. And that was really the impetus for Parakeeto, the company I run today, to start, which was really focused on trying to solve that problem and make it easier for smaller firms to get those kinds of insights and answer those kinds of questions that they're asking themselves every day.
Very cool. Well, awesome. Well, let's talk about kind of why people are listening, right? Like, we all want to be more profitable. I don't understand too. A lot of times my first conversations with agencies is they always tell me how many people they have and how big their revenue is. And I'm like, what? I don't care. I was like, I really want to know like how profitable you are and like what's the impact that you're providing to your clients. So what are some ways that are costing agencies profitability that you see?
Yeah. The biggest issue that I see most firms have is that they don't actually know what their gross margin is, or as we've started calling it, delivery margin, because I'm tired of arguing with accountants over semantics of general accounting practice. And really what delivery margin is asking is, after you've fulfilled your promise to the client, how much of every dollar have they paid you that's left over for you to now pay for your overhead and have a profit? And that's a question that most firms can't answer when they look at their financials. And beyond that, even if they could identify it on their financials, and most firms are just a couple of small tweaks away from being able to see that, they don't actually know what to do to improve it. And there's really only 3 ways to improve it. And this is the crazy thing. As you know, profitability in an agency is actually very simple. There's very few things that you need to do in order to improve it. But the framework for how we measure those things, I think, is still stuck in the past, still stuck in the era of everything running off of the billable hour, and the growth of a firm really being predicated on we get more bodies and we utilize those bodies, and that's how we grow revenue and profitability. Of course, in the modern context, most firms, that's not purely how they're operating. Almost everyone I talk to is doing at least some amount of flat rate or value-based pricing, whether that be on projects or retainers. So that's really the big challenge, is they don't actually know how much money they make when they spend an hour or when they spend a month or when they deliver a certain project for a client. And therefore, the basis for their profitability is opaque, and they're not sure what to do to get better.
So what are the 3 variables?
Yeah. So first, let's unpack the formula for delivery margin so I can connect these 3 variables to that formula. And delivery margin, as we measure it, is what we call agency gross income, which is your revenue minus pass-through expenses. So if you're a firm that runs a lot of ads for clients, you would strip out any ad costs.
Yeah, you can't count that shit. Come on, like,
yeah,
that always drives me crazy. I'm like, we're a $20 million agency with 5 people. I'm like, oh, so you buy a lot of media. And they're like, how'd you know?
Yeah.
I was like, come on, like stop counting on it.
I'll guess. Yeah. Video firms also typically have a lot of pass through, right? They're hiring huge production crews or lots of materials, lots of rented gear, all those kinds of things. White label partners that you might hire to do part of an engagement, that would all be considered pass through. So the way to qualify pass through is, am I responsible for the profitability of that revenue? If the answer is no and somebody else is, then you probably want to pass it through. So what's left over is your agency gross income. That's the real revenue for the business. And that's what we want to be measuring profitability against. And the other side of the delivery margin formula is what we call delivery cost. So that's what it costs you to earn that revenue. Most of that is going to be your team's time. If you're looking at this on an agency basis, you're looking at what amount of our payroll is allocated towards delivery. And if you're looking at this on a project basis, it's going to be a function of how much time did we spend and what is the cost of that time. And then there's usually going to be on the agency level 4 to 6% of agency gross income going to what we call shared delivery expenses. So those are like the tools that your team has in their tool belt every day to do their work. Your Figma subscription, your Adobe Creative Cloud subscription, the software you use to manage ads, those kinds of things. Those are usually going to be a small, fairly immaterial, but relevant part of your delivery cost. So the formula for delivery margin is your agency gross income minus your delivery cost divided by your agency gross income. So if you made $1 million and you spent $400K on delivery costs, then you would have a 60% delivery margin. So that's the formula starting out. And the challenge we see a lot of people have with that is all their payroll is in one big bucket on the P&L. All their software costs are in one big bucket. And COGS are just being used to isolate pass-through. So when they look at gross profit on their P&L, what they're actually seeing is their agency gross income. But their accountant's like, wow, you have such great gross profits. It's like, well, actually, we don't know that. We don't know the answer to that. That's because that's not really the number.
Yeah. So, well, continue on the 3 levers.
Yeah. So if we think about that formula, right, there's 2 ways to improve delivery margin. We can either decrease our costs or we can increase the amount of revenue that's generated with the costs that we have. So I'll focus on the boring one, which is decrease our costs. The proxy for that is what we call average cost per hour. So the way we think about this is for every hour that your team spends doing work for clients, on average, what does that time cost? And really that's going to correlate to, if you're using freelancers, obviously the cost of those freelancers. But if you have a payroll team, it's really seniority. How expensive are the people that have to do the majority of the work? And typically the way to lower your average cost per hour is to decrease the level of judgment required for the majority of the work in a given deliverable.
Expand a little bit more on that.
So for example, if you have no processes, you don't, write good creative briefs, you don't do good intake with the client, you don't support your team with a good process, it's going to take somebody very senior to be able to come in and navigate all of that uncertainty and still get a good outcome to the client. So to the extent that you can remove the need for judgment calls through clear process, clear requirements, clear, leverage with technology, templates, those kinds of things, then that enables somebody with less experience and less judgment to be able to come in and do more of the work on a project, and ideally leave that high-level strategic work for, a very small portion of the project. And by doing that, effectively what you do as you scale is you lower the total payroll that you need as a team to get the same kinds of things done. So to the extent that you can lower the required judgment, generally you can lower the level of experience required, which will usually correlate to a lower payroll cost over time.
So rather than, because I know a lot of agencies just do a blended rate, right? So they have a lot of senior people, a lot of junior people, and then they kind of blend them together and they kind of average it out. You're saying kind of split that more, so a lot more of the junior people can actually do the work. The senior people are a lot less time. Is that correct?
Yeah, that of course, that's basically what it is we try to optimize for lower cost people doing more of the work. And if we do that well, again, through usually developing good process, developing clarity of scope, those kinds of things, then we can keep our costs low. And a good example of this is even in our business, I used to do all of the work on our audit product. It took me about 40 hours to do that. Today, an account manager does about 80% of the work. And me as a consultant, I come in, I do that 20% that's really necessary. But all the things like collecting information from the client, setting up all of the spreadsheets, setting up the presentation deck, all those kinds of things now somebody else can do. And that person costs about half as much as I do, or the person that replaces me does. So that's allowed us to cut our average cost per hour down significantly. And even if we don't change the price of that engagement, our profitability has gone up substantially as a result.
Okay. Very cool. Awesome. And what's factor number 2?
Yeah. So average cost per hour is number 1. That's connected to costs. The next 2 are connected to the more fun thing for me, which is how do we get our existing team to earn more revenue without having to actually make any changes there? So the first one to pay attention to is what we call average billable rate. And this is really interesting because a lot of people that hear me say the word average billable rate, immediately they think, well, I don't bill by the hour, so this doesn't apply to me. But the truth is this applies to everybody, no matter what your billing model is, because average billable rate measures for every hour our team spends doing any kind of work, how much revenue does that earn for the business? So regardless of your pricing model, the formula for average billable rate is agency gross income, which we discussed earlier, revenue minus pass-through, divided by what we call delivery hours. That might be the same as a billable hour for you, but it's not always the same.
Yeah. So you're meaning like, if you have 40 hours in the week, and let's say you only have this would be a bad one, 50%. So that means delivery hours would be 20 hours a week, right?
Really what delivery hours are, is any time that is actually spent on that section of work. So let's say, for example, it took you 125 hours to get this project done, but you only billed the client for 100 because somebody messed something up and you didn't really want to piss them off. So you billed them for 100, but it took you 125. When we measure the average billable rate for that engagement, we have to look at all of the time that went in. Right? What was the actual cost to the business, regardless of how it was priced, how it was billed, whether nuance is there? This normalizes for all of those factors and just says, at the end of the day, how much money got moved from the balance sheet to the P&L for a given time period or a given group of work. So that average billable rate, there's two ways to improve it. The first is, of course, pricing increases, and
which is my favorite.
And a ton of time in the last decade talking about price increases or changes to pricing model that can allow you to increase that rate without the perception of a price increase to your client. That's usually an opportunity and a very good one for most firms. But the other side of that doesn't get talked about enough is you can get the same result by decreasing the amount of time it takes you to get a similar deliverable done. And so if you can spend half as much time because you create a better process or templates or you invest in some technology, and you double your average billable rate, what that means is you've doubled the amount of revenue your team can earn with the same capacity.
As long as you're not charging by the hour.
Correct. As long as you're not charging by the hour. So average billable rate, the increase in efficiency really does apply if you're doing more of a billing model that's decoupled from time. But that is the core concept there. So it sounds too easy to be true, but if you can double your average billable rate, you really can double the revenue that your team can earn in a given period of time. And I love this metric because it's so simple. You only need these two pieces of information to calculate it. It doesn't need to go through your accountant or your bookkeeper. And you can use it to start comparing any project, any client, any type of work to another and start to identify, oh, wow, we make a lot more money for every hour we spend on SEO, for example, relative to websites. And that can inform some really great conversations about, should we sell more SEO stuff? Is there something that we should be looking into on websites to make it more efficient? It can really help direct your attention to the right places as it relates to the opportunity to improve your profitability.
Yeah, I'm constantly talking to our mastermind members of this, of going, look, we need to look at which services are the most profitable with like using this lens that you're just talking about and eliminating the ones that aren't profitable that do not lead to the profitable ones. So for example, if you start looking at all of your services and your solutions that you guys are offering and you find two of the services that you're offering that are not profitable or they're barely making any money, then you need to ask yourself, does this lead to something that's profitable? And if the answer is no, please eliminate it and stop doing it. Because I can't tell you how many times I talk to a full service agency and they want to be like, they think that's an advantage, and that is not an advantage unless you're really, really big. And everyone listening here is under 20 million, most cases. If you're not, email me and say, nope, I'm over 20 million. I'll be like, congratulations.
There's a couple of things here. My perspective on the full service agency is like that positioning is only effective if you're a full service to one problem, right? So it's not to say that you can't have multiple service offerings, as you just mentioned, like you can have multiple service offerings, but they should be focused on being a complete solution to one problem, a very specific problem. And what's been interesting is we've audited a lot of agencies since we started Parakeeto, and some of the most profitable agencies that we've ever audited actually outsourced deliberately a lot of their work and had a ton of pass through, which is something that traditionally people would look at, or accountants generally would look at and say, you have, too much pass through or your COGS are too high. But that was a deliberate choice for them because they recognized their strength as operators. They said, we're good at sales, we're good at account management, we're good at strategy. We're not actually that good at the mechanical stuff of delivery. So we're going to give half of our revenue to a partner, but what's left over, we're going to earn super efficiently. And they had like 45% EBITDAs on what was left over. So it was a great business and they scaled really, really quickly as a result. So there's something to be said about getting rid of the operational indigestion. And I think my thesis is the last 10 years have been about specialization in terms of what the client can see. So we solved this specific problem for this specific client. I think the next 10 years are going to be about specialization inside the agency and asking ourselves, what are we good at doing? And let's cut the fat in terms of what we're doing operationally.
Yeah, a lot of our members we've advised where, I'm thinking of Justin as one of our members that recently sold his agency. And we started working with him when they first started. This was like 8 years ago. And they started off as kind of a full service, and then we narrowed them down. And they did exactly that, where they were like, we're really good at sales, we're really good at strategy, and we're really good at finding those partners. And they brought the partners in. But what they also wanted to do is, as they were getting these partners and they can scale up and up and up and up, and these partners started getting 100% of their work was from Justin's agency. So now Justin was like, well, I want to grow faster, but I would like to bring it internal and get a better price. So I'm going to buy them. Now they would go, well, my price is this because of how much the revenue is, and be like, but I'm 100% of your revenue. If I go away, your whole business goes away. So they were able to take them over for a fair price, not an inflated price. Now they got the internal team. And so now they kept doing that and that and that, built it up to an over 8-figure agency and was able to sell. And now they're sitting on a beach doing nothing, which they'll get bored pretty soon. And I guarantee they'll start doing something because that's what happens to everyone.
Yeah, that's a great story. And I'm willing to bet, I don't know the details of this story, but I'm willing to bet that they were also able to do that with very little cash outlay, with, lots of seller financing to have an earnout so that those founders stuck around and it maintained all the things that they wanted to maintain in that acquisition. So that's an amazing strategy.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So what's the third?
Okay. So we talked about average cost per hour. We talked about average billable rate. The third one, which I like to call the dark saber for all of you Star Wars nerds, the dark saber of agency metrics, it's utilization, right? A metric that comes with great power, but also great responsibility, because used improperly, it can just create all kinds of damage in the agency, right? And so utilization rate is really looking at, of all the capacity that you have, that you purchase from your team, what percentage of it is used for earning the average billable rate we talked about earlier, right? So if you have, 1,000 hours, what percentage of those hours in a given period of time are being used to get revenue earned? Now, the problem I see with utilization that most people are calculating it the wrong way is they try to adjust the metric for a bunch of things that happen when they start putting it in front of their team and trying to hold their team accountable to it, which I don't really think is a very good idea, because the reality is your team doesn't have control over how much work they have to do. That's your responsibility and your management team's responsibility to properly resource the agency and make sure everybody has clarity on what to work on and that they have enough work to work on. So utilization, I think, is a metric for the management team, and it really shows their competency in balancing their payroll and their staff to the work that's coming in. And the objective with utilization is essentially to get it as high as you can get it without damaging the culture that you want to have in your business. For most firms, on an annual basis, for the entire team, this includes people that don't do any work for clients at all, 50 to 60% is where I would expect you to land. If you can do that with normal average billable rates, you should have no problem being profitable. So
for how big of a team would you, are you talking about like a 20-person team, a 40-person team, a 100-person team?
Yeah, it should be roughly the same across all of those scales. But what we will see is these dips as you reach these growth ceilings that I'm sure you've seen all the time, right? So anytime that you're building a management team, which tends to happen right around 8 employees is when your first one is going to start to come together. 25 to 30 is when your second one's going to start to come together. 50 to 60 is when the C-suite's going to start coming together. And at each of those levels, generally, you're having to make these fairly significant investments in people that are not really going to be billable at all. And they're designed to buy back the time of the founder and create, operational rigor inside the business. So you will see dips in the model at those points in time. But really, when you zoom out and you look at the whole agency, you should be able to run the math. And it's really quite simple. You take the capacity of the whole team, you go through each person and say, how much of their time do I expect to be spent on client work? And that should allow you to get to a sense of, okay, what is really the capacity of this team for utilization? And then you multiply that capacity by the average billable rate you expect to make. And that'll give you a sense of how much revenue that team can handle. And now you have a sense of, okay, I know how much I plan to spend on payroll with this team. I know how much revenue I need to target and how much they can handle without getting burnt out. Does that get me the profit margins that I need? Does that give me enough budget for overhead? So that's the power of these 3 really simple numbers. Your revenue capacity at any given moment is just your capacity multiplied by your utilization rate, multiplied by your average billable rate. So that's how you would kind of work through those decisions or get an understanding of what do I need to do in order to earn the right to make this, hire in this COO maybe a little earlier than I should because I want that person, or to invest in this larger office earlier than maybe I should because I want to. You can start to look at, okay, well, if we got our average billable rate up by 20%, then we'd be able to afford that. Or if we got our utilization up just a little bit, we'd be able to afford that.
Yeah. I always looked at, and it comes in phases. Everyone listening is think about, kind of the first phase is how do I get more efficient? Like I always love the analogy of the refrigerator repairman, right? He comes in and he talks to the young lady that the refrigerator's not working. And he goes to behind the refrigerator, turns one screw, gives her a bill for $1,000. And she's like, $1,000? You spent 5 minutes on it. He's like, well, let me break down the invoice for you. It was $100 for turning the screw. It was $900 for knowing which screw to turn. And so I always looked at it as, how can I get more efficient? And then how do I charge more? Those double. Like literally, I remember, and then also too, it's also about the audience you're going after. It's about the value that they perceive. I tell the story many times. I know a lot of you have heard it, but if you're the first time listener, you'll hear it one more time. I went into a company I never heard of, and I pitched them I think $10,000 or $20,000 website. Yeah, at the time, that was a lot for us, but they laughed at us and they didn't go with us because they were expecting a $300,000 website proposal, and they were Berkshire Hathaway, and they still have their crappy website today. Like if you literally go to it, it's the same exact website from like 25 years ago, but they're one of the biggest companies. So you got to think, if you put all those together and then your utilization rate, and actually my utilization rate, when I think back at Solar, I think we were around 70-75%. But we had a different structure. So, that's the cool thing about doing the podcast and chatting with agency owners and all different type of people. There's 1,000 ways to do things. What I always want all of you to do is just take little bits and pieces, because no one has a silver bullet. If they say they have a silver bullet, I want you to smack them in the face and run away really fast. But take all that silver and build your own silver bullet, and just build on all the frameworks that we go over. So.
And you mentioned something that I think is really important to articulate here to everyone that's listening, which is that there are an infinite number of ways to be profitable as a firm. And, I've worked with firms doing all kinds of interesting things, firms doing the 4-day work week, right? And so conventional knowledge would say, well, you can't be profitable doing the 4-day work week because your utilization rate will be too high. But if you remember that, well, utilization and average billable rate multiplied by your capacity get you to your revenue, well, then it's just a question of, okay, well, what does our average billable rate need to be in order for us to maintain this? So really the important thing is delivery margin, making sure that you can get to at least 50% on your profit and loss statement. That'll allow you to spend about 30% on overhead, which is generally what we see, and have at least a 20% EBITDA. And then there's an infinite combination of utilization rates and average billable rates that you can achieve to get there. And then it becomes a question of what kind of firm do you want to run and what's important to you and how are you positioned and what are the very legitimate constraints that you might be up against in your market based on what you choose to sell and how you choose to position yourself. But there isn't one way to do this. And so hopefully this is going to help enlighten people to how to perceive the benchmarks, because there's tons of benchmarking that happens around these metrics. None of it is consistent, by the way. Like, I've been on the back end of these benchmarking surveys. They're not usually defining like what is capacity when they're benchmarking utilization. So you'll see firms with 95% utilization. It's just because they're measuring capacity differently, or they count internal stuff as billable hours. So don't pay too much attention to the benchmarking. Really think about the context for your firm and understand that you can design this to be profitable, and there's not just one way to do it. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Awesome. Well, this has been amazing, Marcel. Thanks so much for coming on the show. Make sure everyone goes check out your guys' site. And if you guys never want to miss out on an episode or any of the content that we're putting out, make sure you go to swenkit.com, sign up for the newsletter. We're always sending out valuable information every single week. So go do that now. And until next time, have a swank day.